told myself I wasn't going to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. So I was just watching a little video about Alan Watts talking about nothing, which is fascinating. I love that topic. It's one of my favorite topics in philosophy, and Alan Watts is a great philosopher. I love listening to Alan Watts. But I disagree with him a lot. And this is one of those times. Because he brings up in this video about how you can't have nothing without something. What is it? He has a video. Yeah, there it is. So this video here, why nothing is more powerful than something. So, now granted, I only made it a little way in because I got overexcited and I had to say something about nothing. So he goes through this video, and I've heard this from Alan Watts before, so it's not like I'm prejudging him. He says this several times before I even stopped this particular time that he was saying this, because he said it before. And I've heard Sartre say it, and I've heard all kinds of people say it, but nobody ever brings up the third thing. The thing in between being and nothing. And what's interesting to me is that while Alan Watts was talking about how you can have magnets where if you were to chop a bar magnet in half, you would just have another north and south pole on either end. And I was thinking, well, what if you made 2 incisions instead of 1, leaving a centerpiece? And then you get, a north and a south pole. And if you were to do that over and over and over, always leaving the little sliver in the center alone, no matter how narrow that bar ever got, so goes his argument, you would never reach a place in which north and south were to cease, where you don't have any more magnet left for there to be a north and south pole. Well, what if they're only 1 atom thick, and then it just changes direction? And then what if they're only 1 atom wide and 2 atoms long? Well, then you've got, 2 poles. And then what about the contact point in between the poles? Which direction does that flow? And eventually you get to this point where you're like, wait, there is something that's in between being and nothing, because if you only had being sharply, abruptly contrasted with nothing, then you would end up with discrete objects. There would be a very rigid, sharp, cutting resolution, definition in between nothing and something. And yet, you get such vague statements from people when they talk about something and nothing. And they show you quick examples, like I'm holding a cigarette in my right hand, but not in my left. And then we get this idea that being is the cigarette. Well, what is that? What is this being? And no one ever really talks about it. Well, if you put in this third thing, indiscernibility, in between being and nothing, it helps you define what something is. Because think about this. The characteristic about nothing that makes it so unique is that it's not only indiscernible, meaning that, and Alan Watts does get this right, anybody that thinks about nothing for even a little while, if you seriously think about nothing, you'll immediately understand this. He's absolutely right about this part. And nothing that he said was wrong necessarily through what I've seen so far of his video. It's just that he misses this. He doesn't put it in there. I'm adding on to what he was saying. And the reason is because he misses such a huge part of it. When you leave out indiscernibility, which is in between being and nothing, then the only thing that you can really do is say that being is just anti-nothing. It's just not nothing. Well, that doesn't really explain what it is. That just explains what it is not. And that's the irony, is that if you were to start with nothing and being, you'd know less about being than you would about nothing. And yet nothing is indiscernible, and we can't know anything about it because there's no it for us to know. And yet we have a greater grasp of it than we do of being. The cigarette is simply not an emptiness. What is it? He never says, or at least he didn't yet. Maybe if I continue, he'll say it. I don't know. But the part that I watched, he didn't say. And I've never seen anyone ever say what being is. And so I'll demonstrate why indiscernibility helps define what is being, not just what it isn't. So consider that nothing is indiscernible, that if you were to stare into the abyss, you would not see anything. It's not that you would see nothing. No one has ever seen nothing. But I would say anti-discern it from other things, because there's nothing there to discern, but we know the difference between nothing and something. Even the name, nothing, we can name it or whatever. Our concept of nothing has the name nothing, but nothing is still just the concept and the name are just pointing at something that doesn't exist, and it's very slippery, and that's what makes it such a weird thing. And I agree with Alan Watts. It is the weirdest thing that I've ever come across either. It's absolutely fascinating. You could spend your entire life on nothing. It's slippery. It's very strange. So, like I say, it's not, and he says the word inconceivable. I use the word indiscernible, but it's essentially the same thing. We're both basically getting at the same thing, but there's a very slight, subtle, sharp, precise difference. Inconceivable means if I can't think of it, it's very Kantian. If I can't think of it, it must not be able to exist. If it's not capable of being rendered into logical abstraction, not just for me, but for anyone who's rational, then it must not be able to exist. This is very close to the truth, but it's not entirely true. And this, again, it happens when people haven't quite fully developed the philosophy yet. They're on the right track, but they haven't developed it fully. So they're missing terms like, or definitions like what is being and all that. And I'm getting to that. So there is not anything there to be discerned about nothing, but we can discern nothing from inconceivability, as he said the word. The inconceivability of nothing is not nothing. It's a type of relativistic absence. It's not really nothing. Like, if I were to open a drawer, which is quote unquote empty for all conventional purposes, and say there's nothing in there, that's false. There's air in there. There's light in there, because I checked it. I opened it up. Therefore, there should be light so I can see what's in it. If it were in a dark room and I opened the cupboard, I probably wouldn't be able to tell if there was anything in it unless I felt around in there. And even then, I wouldn't be able to be so confident in saying that there's nothing in there. Maybe there's a piece of paper slipped off to the side or a crumb or something like that that I just didn't happen to feel. But irregardless, there's something in the cupboard, because the cupboard is not capable of sustaining a vacuum, because there is no such thing as a vacuum in physics. You'll never find a true vacuum, and you can never create a true vacuum. And if you ever attempt to, you'll get forced not to. Nature will intervene. You cannot have a true vacuum. And even if you were to have a vacuum of, let's say, physical matter and physical energy, you still wouldn't have a true vacuum, because there would still be some kind of space. There would be some kind of... I know that they say that there is no quote-unquote ether, but there's something there. If it isn't the ether they imagined, it's another kind of ether. But there is some kind of ether. Some kind of space manifestation. Or maybe you can call it dark energy or dark matter or whatever. I don't know what exactly the name should be. I like the term ether. It's very ancient, and it really gets at the core idea of what is not nothing, because he says this too, and he's absolutely right. The distance between us and the moon is not filled with nothing. And even if it were, then it would prove that nothing has some substance, because it's filling the distance between us and the moon. So I agree with Alan Watts, that cannot be nothing, because nothing is not substantial. It doesn't fill anything in, because there's nothing there for it to be used as a filler. So there is not anything there to discern. is completely different from the indiscernibility of it or the inconceivability of it. Because likewise, I can't conceive of an idea that I've never encountered, that I know, that I don't have a name for, that I've never thought of. I can't think of a thought that I can't think of a thought from someone else's mind, for example. What your mind is doing right now is inconceivable to me. I cannot discern what is or is not inside your head. I can't conceive in my mind or give birth to the concept that you have in your head, in my head. I can't do that. I can't just reach into your mind and put your thought in my own head, which would be me conceiving of your idea. But that act of being unable to conceive of your idea is not your idea, nor is it nothing. And so it's its own thing. The idea, I call it the midpoint. Everything has a midpoint. Everything has a point, or not even a midpoint. I would say like the separation between what is and what isn't it. And so he uses the analogy as like the background and the foreground, the figure in the background. You have to have the background in order to discern the figure, because if all you had was the figure, then the figure would take up the entirety of your perceptual view, and then there would be no edges for you to say that that's what that is. It would warp around your field of vision, and by the time it was done warping to fill that entirety of your field of vision, it would cease to be in the shape of the figure. So while the figure itself the image of the figure might fill your perceptive vision, since that's all you could possibly ever see, what that would look like is again indiscernible. Because if you were to have some, I don't know, let's say a person, and you're looking at them, and they're so tall and so wide in comparison to everything else around them, and then you remove everything else around them, and then there's blackness, and then you remove the blackness, and the only thing that can be left is their skin. And then where does their skin and the air begin? Well, you've got so many divots and stuff. Let's say you worked all that out. Well, then what's just beyond that? Well, nothing. So if you try to remove everything else that you possibly can that's adjacent to the person's skin that you're trying to imagine, if you've erased everything else around it, there is still this blackness, there is still this emptiness, there is still this space, there is still this distance in between them and you for you to be able to see them. And now imagine there is no more distance in between you and them. And now how do you see them? Can you see into your own eyes? No. So we have to have this relativity, and that distance is necessary in order for us to discern, but it is not necessary in order for something to exist. And the reason is because I don't have to separate myself from myself in order to exist. I can be one with myself and yet exist. How is that possible? There must be some quintessential thing about me or myself that exists. And then you could say, well, that's just an illusion. And that's why people have experienced ego death, and so there is no real such thing as me. And I would agree to some extent. But when I say that I don't exist, it's very strange. It's a very strange statement to say that. I don't exist. Who is the one who said I don't exist? I suppose you could erase nouns and you could just say, it has been said that he doesn't exist. Or it has been said, quote, I don't exist, end quote. But you don't ever say who said it. You just say it was said. Now imagine that everyone is in conversation with everyone in a room, and then try recounting the dialogue without using nouns. And then you'll start to see this pattern emerge. And you'll immediately attune to this and say, well, one of them, and you'll come up with some name, the man, the woman, the fat guy, the skinny guy, the high-pitched voice person, and the low-pitched voice person. And you'll discern a continuous pattern between them and say, this one said this and that one said that. And you'll recognize this difference. even if you remove the nouns. You're still using them, you're smuggling them in without you perceiving it. And so we didn't destroy the I, we didn't get rid of it, we just stopped naming it. But that doesn't make it unrecognized. It doesn't make the pattern go away. It just makes us stop recognizing it. Now, if we were to stop thinking about anything, that is about as close as we could ever get to thinking about nothing. But those are two completely different things. Thinking about nothing is not the same thing as not thinking, because thinking is not the same as not thinking. So thinking about nothing is not the same thing as not thinking about something. There's some kind of an active presence of absence, is what I call that. And it's paradoxical, and this is why I believed for the longest time that nothing can't just be nothing. And he says this similarly. He says, if you were to imagine removing all being, and that there was only nothing, just space, 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 forever, on and on and on. And then he says, but you're imagining it. And that's true, but that's still solipsistic. What if you were to imagine a place in which there was just space, 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 and you're not looking at it, and you're not in it, you're away from it? Let's say you're God, or you're somehow detached from this world that you're perceiving. Well then, there's again this distance in between the self and the observer. And you can still say the same thing Alan Watts said. But then imagine that you don't exist either, and that you're part of this nothing. And then there's only space because you're only space also. And then you can't conceive it because you aren't there to conceive of it. And even if you were, there would still be edges to that world. So if you were to say, there is nothing, the there and the is are in contradiction to the nothing, because there is no thing there for there to be a there or an is. So that state in which it cannot be that there is nothing is a state of indiscernibility, which is not nothing. The indiscernibility is what we arrive at. It's the brick wall that we arrive at just before we hit nothing, the real nothing. Because, of course, if we were to confront the real nothing, it would rip our face off and we wouldn't be able to see anything, let alone it. Because we would dissolve into it. It would absorb us because it's totally intolerant. There can't be anything there. You have nothing to push back on. There's nothing there. It would rip you apart. So, being that that's the case, there is this very specific state that is not yet being, because we have yet to conceive of something, we have yet to discern something, so there cannot be anything there. But yet, well, it's not even just that we haven't, it's that it cannot be done, because such a state in which there was nothing would be a state of indiscernibility. It's paradoxical. It can't be reduced to nothing, because it's nothing being nothing, which is entirely distinct from nothing itself. And this is what he was saying, is that we only have ever this concept of nothing, and this concept of nothing is actually indiscernibility, not nothing. That space, 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 that impossible world in which there was only nothing, that is indiscernibility. That is our concept of nothing, but it is not nothing. And that distinction is absolutely necessary because it's also not being. And I don't think that Alan Watts ever really got that deep into it. From the part that I've heard so far, I'll have to finish it, but I got overexcited. And I have yet to hear him say if he would consider that state to be being, or there to be anything there. I think what he's saying, if I understood what he was saying, was that since this is impossible, that we can just dismiss it as never having been. And that's not quite right either, because if it never had been, how did it appear in our heads for us to talk about? So it's stuck halfway in between real nothing, which it can't be, and real being, which it doesn't quite make it to. And so there has to be this midpoint. It's not really a midpoint, but it's somewhere in between being and nothing. I believe the most helpful visualization of visualizing these three absolutes, being, nothing, and indiscernibility, or our concept of nothing. Our concept of nothing, nothing itself in actuality, and being itself. And there's a center of nothing, because if we were to look at the inside of a point, this is what I tried to do. I tried to zoom in. Let's imagine that we start where we are at the human scale, or whatever scale that we're at. We start at the current scale, the normal scale, whatever scale you happen to choose, any given scale, and then zoom in, reduce that scale all the way down to a single point so that you're only aware of one singularity. And then imagine what is inside of that point. And you can say, well, it would be filled with a volume of infinite diversity and a vast array of all kinds of things, which is, again, a state of indiscernibility. So we, on the outside of this point, see the surface area of it as being, because we've compressed everything that we can possibly conceive of, everything that exists, into a single point. So that outside would be the being. That's what being is. It's a totality of all the relations in any given area. And that is what a being is. It's an integration of relations. So you've got a bunch of parts. Let's say it's a pie. Well, you've got your pie filling, you've got your crust, you've got the crust being the periphery outside part that you see, and then you've got the filling inside of that. And the filling goes on until you reach the center. And the center has no filling in it because it's the center point. So there wouldn't be any filling in that point. It would just be the center point. There wouldn't be any filling in it because we're talking about a zero space where there's no room for anything. And that's what a point is. A point is a geometrical object whose surface area is the limit of zero. It's not zero, because if it were zero, then it wouldn't be there. So it has some peripheral skin. But that skin is so tightly wrapped around itself that it has no volume. So it's only a skin, which makes it hollow. So the only part of the point that exists is the surface area that we use to mark it. And we say that it occupies a space, which is non-zero because it must occupy some space. Otherwise, it wouldn't exist for us to use as an object. So all objects extend a non-zero amount into some abstract space or distance. If you were to try to imagine an object which had zero distance of length, width, or height, it wouldn't have any dimensions, at which point it wouldn't exist. And then you could say, well, it would be like an idea, like a number, or something like that, that's extremely abstract. But even that has an abstract space. There's an abstract distance between the number 1 and the number 2, which we don't ignore or just say is willy-nilly arbitrary. It's very precise. So it's still definitely a space. It's not a physical space, but it's an abstract space. And then if you remove that, then you have no space. You have zero space. You have nothing. There is no space. And so at that point, you're at the inside of a point, which would be nothing. You would have nothing there because you have the limit of zero surrounding zero. And that's what a point is. It's zero space surrounded by 1 divided by infinity, or the limit of zero. Surface area, or skin. And its center would also be nothing. A point has a center, which is nothing, and then it has a volume, which is nothing, and then it has a peripheral skin, which is all of what it is. That's one of the reasons that a point is an impossible object, but it serves as a good marker because it's discernible, because it has some peripheral skin. So if we were to penetrate that, then we have the area or space. Imagine that you've approached this point and you approach it closer and closer and closer until you're standing on it. And then you penetrate that surface area. What you'll find on the other side of it is not the other side of the peripheral skin. You would think, right? But as you approach that point, it retains its spherical shape, does it not? It doesn't flatten. And if it did, if it flattened completely, then there would be no other side of it. So to stand on one side, to stand on any part of its surface, is identical to standing on any other part of its surface because it's a single point. It can only have one area. Now, if you were to penetrate it, then what you would find adjacent to that cannot be the other side, but yet it also cannot be its surroundings because we've only moved adjacent to the skin, the inside of it. So if you were to imagine that you were to unfold the point as if it were made out of paper, you would have two sides of that. And then you crumple it back up and it returns into a point, a hollow sphere. If you were to then penetrate one part of it, then you wouldn't find the background surrounding the point on the other end of it. You would find, nor would you find the other end of the point because it doesn't have one. If it had an other end to it, then you could say that you were on the other side of that end, and then you could say that you're right back at the background. But that's not possible because it only has one end. It only has one bit of surface area. There is no other side to it. It's like a monopole magnet. It has no other end. So if you were to penetrate it, then you can't possibly be on the other end of it to go back into the background because it has no other end. And you can't still be on the same surface because you've penetrated it, and you can't be on the other side of the surface and yet still on the surface because it only has one surface. So then if you were to penetrate it, you could only either be in a state of indiscernibility or in a state of nothing. If you were in a state of nothing, when you penetrated the point, you would end up on the other side because there's nothing there to penetrate. So if you were, then you would end up on another side of it, as if you had jumped in between the points or in between one part of the surface area and another. But that's not possible because it only has that one point. So there is no other end to do that. So there can't be this hollowness of nothing all throughout its volume. But there is a hollowness at its center for certain. But between its center and its volume and its peripheral skin, there is a state of indiscernibility. That state is necessary. It's just as necessary as the surface area of that point. So, if the volume of that point is not its center because it has a volume, and all volumes are distinct from their centers, then there's an indiscernible amount of space in between the zero and the limit of zero periphery that's around it. And so what that is it's 1 divided by infinity divided by 2. And the reason that you divide it by 2 is because it's halfway in between 0 and itself. 1 divided by infinity, and 1 divided by infinity is equal to the surface area of the point. So the surface area of the point is equivalent to 1 divided by infinity. That's its value. In whatever unit you want, volume or area or whatever. Since it's a zero-dimensional object, it doesn't have an extension into any of the other dimensions, so that's one of the reasons it's a point. And that's one of the reasons it has no other side to it. And so its peripheral skin is 1 divided by infinity, zero-dimensional units. And so when you go just past that toward its center, which must be 0, because it has 0 space at its center, obviously, just beneath its periphery, you could say, well, that must be 0, because we're going past the limit of 0. So therefore, we must have reached 0. But that's false. Necessarily false, because if you were to say that you know the area or location that is beyond infinity, then I'm going to call you crazy. So if you say there's a peripheral skin around this, well, at this point, at the location of this point, there's a peripheral skin whose surface area is equivalent to 1 divided by infinity, because it's an infinitesimally small point, which means it doesn't have a static numerical value. It has a constantly shrinking value that if you were to measure it at any static finite point, that point would not be its actual point. It would be somewhere along the line as you approach 0. So if you were to take 1 and divide it by infinity, it's not equal to 0. It's equal to the limit of 0. It's the limit of 1 as it approaches 0. It's so small that it almost has no value, but it still has a non-zero value, and it's 1 divided by infinity. So you have 1 divided by infinity on one side, and we'll say that represents being. That's the being of the point. And then we go the smallest amount that you could ever possibly go, just beyond that limit. And the only way that we could do that is if we zoomed in so that the reference frame that we're using encompasses the entire point. So at the edge of our reference frame, that's the edge of the point's peripheral limit. And just barely inside of the reference frame, we'd be able to see or discern something, right? Because at the edge of our peripheral vision, we can't see anything. So if we were, again, like Alan Watts said, if you were to think of something as being space, 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 there'd be no edge. Well, if there's no edge, you can't really conceive of it. Just like if something is just beyond your vision, you can't see it. So if something were to occupy the exact limit of your reference frame, it itself would be indiscernible because it would be at the same location as that which separates what is excluded and what is included in the reference frame. Being that the reference frame itself is somewhere in between exclusion and inclusion, it can't really be visible, but it also can't be excluded as invisible. It's the edge of our peripheral vision. If we were to zoom in that deeply, that's how far deep you have to get in order to discern the difference between nothing and indiscernibility and being. So if being then is that peripheral skin of the point, indiscernibility is just beyond that, but not at the center of the point. Meaning that if you were to penetrate any part of that peripheral skin, it only has one part because it's 1 divided by infinity big. So it has no room for there to be a multiplicity of points, because then there would be something larger than one. There would be more than one. But this is one divided by infinity, so there's only one surface area, location. And that's why it has no other side and it has no other part. So there isn't an ability to visualize this very well, because it's not an object that we will come into contact with in relativity. It's actually past relativity, because there's only one part to look at. And if you were to try to go past that, then again, you can't arrive at nothing abruptly, because how can you discern the edge of nothing? There is no edge of nothing. So if nothing is at the center, and you say it's at the volume, then you would know what the edge of nothing is, because it would share its limit with being. Because if it shared its limit with being, then the edge of nothing would be 1 divided by infinity. And so they would both have the same limit. And because they both had the same limit, then nothing would cease to be nothing. It would actually be something, or at least it would be something other than nothing, because it would be a measurable object and it would become a point. So that is how you get something from nothing. It's because of the fuzziness in between nothing and something, which is the definition of being and the definition of nothing, which excludes nothing and includes being. And if you constructed that definition, very much like the reference frame, its location is always at something, which means it is neither it nor not it. It's defining what is and what is not. It isn't itself. It's just defining what is and what isn't. So it's neither not there at all, because it doesn't have some kind of existence, but neither does it have total existence in order to actually be something that is. It's halfway in between. In other words, you've got not being, which is nothing. You've got becoming, and then you've got the noun being at the end of that process. So you need 3, not 2, in order to really make sense of it. If you were to go just beyond the limit of 0, you cannot find 0 right at the other end of the limit of 0, because then the limit of 0 and 0 would have the same value, because they would share the same limit. So you would know exactly how much non-zero space that 0 takes up, and that's not possible, because then 0 can't be 0. So the center then is nothing, the volume is indiscernibility, and then the peripheral skin is the being. And this is very interesting when you start to visualize this, is that you're surrounded, and Alan Watts again got very close to this idea. He said, we're all just made out of bits of nothing. And that's what he means. It's this bubble. So on the outside skin of this bubble, you've got being. On the inside of it, you've got indiscernibility, which is sort of like a fog. And then at the center of that fog, you have nothing, an absence. And that's what everything is. You have being, which is what makes the contact point. Because if there were no contact in between beings, then I would understand the idea entirely, being that we're all just nothing. But there is this contact point. It does change something when I interact with it. It changes it. So there is a contact point, but there's something beyond the contact point. There's something which is contacting something else. And yet we don't know what exactly it is, because there's no such thing as something in and of itself. And so it is indiscernible, it is inconceivable, but yet it's not nothing. Another one would be, who am I, or who are you? And then eventually you will, if you have any definition, I can dismantle it, and so can you. And eventually you'll run into, I don't know. I can't see into my own eyes. I don't know exactly who I am, because I don't have enough information to be able to say exactly what I am. I could say, I'm a soul. Well, what is a soul? Well, it floats around. As the guy in Bedazzled says, no one knows what a soul is. If you try to say what it is, it's like saying what time is or what space is. You either know what it is or you don't, but you can't define it. It's ineffable. So many people say, but that's not actually true. Because we can tell the difference between space and time, then we can tell what is and what isn't each of those by defining what they are and what they aren't. We can define what their properties are and what they aren't. So, space is when you've got not something and you have something and you have a measurable distance between something and not something. So I have to have two referents. So each referent is distinct and discernible from the other, or at least anti-discernible, so that I can tell them apart. So one of them goes over here and the other one goes over there. And then I say, one of them being distinct from the other has a level of distinction which begins and ends. When it begins to be distinct from the other, then there's space. And when it ends, that there is any difference between it and the other, then space ends, and there is no more room for space. And that's why I have no distance in between myself and myself, because there is no difference, there is no distinction between myself and myself. So you can actually define what space is. It's the distance between what is and what is not. And time can also be defined. What comes before and what comes after something is a causal relation. So time is about causation. It's about what causes what. And causes always precede effects. So if, just like Aristotle taught, if I know what the origin of something is, then I know what caused it, because whatever happened at its origin, there we go, it didn't happen, never mind. Whatever happens at its origin is its cause, and whatever happens at its terminus when it ends, that's the effect. So when I'm born, the cause of my birth is the formation of my zygote. And what forms my zygote, what the origin of my birth is conception, is the fertilization of my mother's egg from my father's sperm. And when those conjoin and turn into one being, then I am conceived. I am a zygote. And this zygote then goes on to develop and eventually exit the womb and grow up and die. And when it dies, that's the end of my life, and that's the end of my time, and I have no more time left. And that's because the effect has ended, and that's because the cause has reached its full conclusion of impact. It has no more room left for it to exert influence, and so the effect ends. Because the effect is dependent upon the cause, and the cause eventually has some cessation because of the limits of space. And so space is more fundamental than time, because without space there cannot be a time, because space is just the distance between what is and what is not. Time is the distance between when something originates its distinction from something that is not, and then ceases that distinction between what it is and what it is not. And the same can be said when I die. The distance between myself and everything else ceases. I no longer have a distinct self, because everything about me that makes me distinct from my environment, which is to say my animism, my vitality, my persona, is disintegrated and turned into everything else around me. Now I only exist in the past as distinct from my cause. My cause being the formation of my zygote, My death being the death of the being that grew from that zygote. That when the zygote is said to die eventually, being that after it has split into so many different cells, and each of those split off derivative cells, or daughter cells, or whatever you want to call them, each of those derivative cells that grew off of my zygote, my original single cell that I started off from, splits into 2, and then 4, and then 8, and then 16, and then 32, and 64, and so on. And it continues exponentially to grow until I reach, a certain height and weight. And then it just tries to maintain for the rest of my life. And eventually it can't maintain anymore. This constant derivation of one from the next, from the next, from the next, from the next. And eventually it runs out of the ability to split anymore because the telomeres, the DNA strand, gets so short that there's no more room left for it to be copied. It loses a little bit each time until it shortens so short that it can't be wound into a rope anymore, if you want to use that kind of an analogy. If you've ever seen someone twine rope or string, then you know what I mean. There has to be a certain length of string or whatever your fabric textile thing that you're working with has to be a certain length in order for you to wind it around another one. And if you can't wind them anymore because they've basically turned into dust, then you no longer have fabric. You can't turn dust into fabric. It isn't long enough to twine into wrapped around string anymore. It's just dust. It doesn't wind anymore. So, given that that eventually must happen, we can then say the organism, you don't have to call it a zygote anymore because it's no longer a single cell, but it's the same organism that it always has been, ceases because it can no longer sustain itself and it dies. And so then the effect ends. And that's an indiscernibility in between nothing and being. And the being is, like I say, that peripheral skin. So when you see someone, they've already quote unquote died or ceased to exist, no matter what, because it takes a certain amount of time for the light to bounce off of them into your eyes. It takes a certain amount of time for the sound waves to escape out of their face hole and into your ear hole. It takes a certain amount of time for your brain to register the tactile connection between your skin and theirs if they were to touch you, etc. It always takes time for that information to process. So whoever they are, you never meet. You only ever meet the after image, the afterglow, the echo, after they've already expressed something. The effect or experience that you have of that person is always temporally and spatially distinct from the person themselves. So, given all of that information, what makes something be is its non-contradiction between its parts. It's that the parts fit integrated into a whole, and the actualization or manifestation of something is the convergence of possibilities. So the background and the foreground have to agree on where those end. If the background impedes upon the foreground, then the foreground doesn't really exist. It just melts into the background because it's being absorbed by it, because it's being impeded upon by the background. And likewise, if the foreground impedes upon the background, then you don't have the distinction anymore because one has absorbed the other and they reduce back into a singularity and they don't really have any discernibility about them anymore. So, in order to say that something is distinct from indiscernibility and nothing, then we say it's discernible, that you can conceive of it, that you can know it, that you can see it, taste it, touch it, smell it, interact with it, that it exists independently of you, that it extends in space and time, at least some iota, that it doesn't have a zero space or zero time extension. It extends into space some amount, some finite non-zero amount, and it extends into time. It lasts some duration that's longer than zero. It has some extension in time. So, that extension into time and space has a certain finite value, which we say is the being of it. That's the totality of their self, their life, their emergence, manifestation, being. And then if you were to take little bits of that life and say a particular episode, you would say that that episode is indiscernible, because where exactly it starts and where exactly it ends is up to whatever arbitrary definition that you want to come up with. It's not concrete or structurally that way. You just arbitrated some distinction where there really isn't one, but you made one appear arbitrarily. And this is the one that I don't expect most people that are listening to this to really understand unless they've really critically, deeply thought about nothing and the edge thereof, because everything has a limit. If nothing had no limit, we would be nothing. It would have impeded upon us. And there is a very strange idea indeed. What is the edge of nothing? Indiscernibility. The inconceivability of nothing is its limits. And so we say it has anti-limits. There is an area or volume or whatever you want to call it, a place in which there is not nothing, and that place is everywhere. And there is a time in which there is not nothing, and that is all the time or every time. And that then necessitates that there is what we would call no place or no time in which nothing expresses itself. So in this no place and no time area, or whatever you want to call it, then you have nothing. And so it has anti-limits because it's in an anti-space, anti-time. It's not in a place, it's not in a space, because it has no space, but it's in anti-space. And it has no time, so it's in anti-time. So this isn't exactly the same thing as it being, but it is expressing itself in some discernible way, because now we can say what it isn't, then we can discern what it isn't from it. And then to go further to say what nothing actually is impossible. It's indiscernibility. By the time that you ascribe an is to it, then it becomes indiscernibility. In other words, if you were to have nothing commit the act of being by being non-contradictory with itself, then it would compose a self. It would compose an edge. And so nothing is then said to naturally decay into indiscernibility, inconceivability, an unknowable, ineffable distance. And if that weren't the case, we wouldn't be able to name it. We wouldn't be able to say that there isn't anything there, because we wouldn't be aware that there was nothing there to begin with. Think about all the things that you've never thought of. Well, you can't, because you haven't thought of them. And if you were to try to think of something that you can't think of, then you would be able to think of it, in which case you can't think of it. Because it's not something that you didn't think about, or something that you couldn't think about. So to think about something you can't think about is the same thing as nothing being nothing. It's the same thing as nothing happening or nothing existing. The happening is not nothing, and it contradicts nothing. Nothing does not happen. And so, how then does nothing exert an influence? How then does it extend into our consciousness? Well, it extends there because of its trace remnant of indiscernibility, and the indiscernibility is what we interact with. And so if we, the being, are interacting with indiscernibility, then the only thing left is nothing, and that's what the indiscernibility points to. It's saying that if you were to use me as a marker, just think about something that's just beyond me, and then you get to nothing. You don't ever actually get to nothing, but then you haven't really stayed still either. You've moved into some area of indiscernibility, inconceivability, attempting to conceive of this thing called nothing, without ever having reached nothing, but having most definitely escaped being. That is indiscernibility. Now, to say that you remove even that would be to remove not only yourself, the conceiver, or the discerner, but to remove any ability to transmit any information. And so you, even if you had seen nothing, you would never be able to describe it, because by the time that you've finished your description, or even begun it, you've initiated into and interacted with indiscernibility, because we cannot interact with nothing. There isn't anything there to interact with. We cannot conceive of nothing. There isn't anything there to conceive of. So then what is it that we keep interacting with, and what is it that we keep discerning and saying, this concept and this name, nothing? What is this name? Nothing. What is this concept? Nothing. That is indiscernibility. That is the only thing that we get to interact with when we attempt to go toward nothing. When we attempt to penetrate into nothing, we are thrown off, and a brick wall appears of indiscernibility. So indiscernibility is very necessary, and it's distinct, like I said, from being. It's not a state of being, because all states of being can be described. I feel happy, I feel sad, I feel confused. I don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what you mean. Those are all descriptions. Those are all states of being. By the time I get to nothing, the only thing that I can say about it is that I don't know what I'm looking at, because it's inconceivable. There isn't anything there to look at. So then I don't really know what that is. But I know that it's not the same thing as saying that I don't know what it is. And so I know I haven't really gotten at it. I've only gotten at the concept of it. I've only gotten at its clothing, but I haven't gotten to its actual body yet. And so that's the state that nothing is always in. It's in a state of intolerance and exclusion, absolute exclusion, even the exclusion of indiscernibility, meaning we can't even say that nothing is inconceivable or indiscernible, because no one's ever seen it to tell. No one's ever been there to actually claim that that's true. No one's ever interacted with it. The only thing that we can interact with is indiscernibility. Nothing is so far removed from being that we can't even say that nothing is anything. Or as Sartre said, nothing is not, and that's all we can say about it. Now, to say that it is indiscernible is a paradox. Nothing is not anything. Nothing is not everything. Nothing is not nothing. Nothing is not. It just is not. Anytime that you put something in between nothing or with nothing, it ceases to be nothing. It turns into indiscernibility. So the result of attempting to interact with nothing is that you receive the result of indiscernibility. But that result is obviously not the same thing as what we were aiming at. And so indiscernibility can't really be being, because we don't know what it is. It's not that we know that it isn't us, because we're conceiving of it. It's sort of part of us, but it's sort of not. It's halfway in between, and so it's indiscernible. It's indiscernibility. Not nothing, but it's what happens to our eyeballs when we look at it, rather than what it is. So when we look at nothing, it erases our vision, and then we can't see. And so because we can't see, as soon as we look at it, we can't see and we're blinded, then we can't actually say anything about nothing, because by the time that we see it, we're already blind. So, given that nothing is not blindness, and given that blindness is not sight, I don't see blindness. I just lose the ability to see. But I also don't cease to exist. I just stop seeing. And so I neither see nor die. I just don't see. And so that's what indiscernibility is. It's neither being nor nothing. It's somewhere in between. And that's what defines what we think of as nothing. And what we define it as, when philosophers look at nothing, we always see indiscernibility. And so we say that being, it must be discernible. And what makes something be is that it is discernible. And what makes something discernible is that it can integrate with other things and interact with other things without absorbing or being absorbed by them. In other words, its limit is shared with their limit. And my fence is shared with your fence. My property line is sharing with your property line. Where my property ends, your property begins. But they're two different limits. They're the limit of my property and the limit of your property, but they are adjacent to each other. And that is what indiscernibility is. It's the defining line in between one thing and another. It's the contact point. But it's not nothing. And so, when we say that being is discernibility, that it is the ability to discern something, and to be something is to be discernible, then all we're saying is that I can call it something. I can say this is such and such, and that is this other thing. And they all get their unique names, and these names are the representative images by which I discern what is something versus what is not something. And like I just showed, all that is telling us is that what an image is. It doesn't tell us what anything actually is, because the definition that we used was indiscernibility, and that was the line in between us, the being, and nothing on the other side of indiscernibility. So I did an absolutely atrocious job of explaining that, and I have no idea how to make that better at the moment. So I think what I'm going to do is drink a beer and erase this, but I might put it up just because.